government borrowing is the biggest issue in finance today.
Governments around the world are addicted to debt.
The sovereign debt levels globally have just grown exponentially.
In the case of the developed countries, the average ratio of public debt to GDP is now back to where it was in 1945. That's rather striking.
It's politically impossible to solve.
Exploding debt is a real worry. If you're an investor, you start wondering what's going to happen and whether there's going to be debt default.
The music stops when you get a major crisis.
The big question is, at what point does the bond market break?
We just don't want the bond yield to get up to a point where it crushes the economy, because then the bond vigilantes will have taken their vengeance.
A determined central bank can always override any market pressure.
I think bond investors should be terrified. Let's face it, the world is addicted to debt. Pretty much every country, okay, leaving Germany aside, has very large amounts of government borrowing.
We've started to take it as so normal now that governments borrow enormous amounts of money relative to their GDP.
The US, Japan, Canada, Italy, France, all of these countries have very high debt levels by historical standards.
Wherever you look, you see problems of government debt or deficit. The US, where the deficit is about 7% of GDP. China also has a very large deficit.
It's a playbook that we've seen going back at least to the global financial crisis. You borrow your way out of trouble, and the way that you pay for that borrowing is more borrowing. And we don't seem to have a way out of this cycle at the moment, at least in some of the biggest economies in the world.
In the case of the developed countries, the average ratio of public debt to GDP is now back to where it was in 1945. That's rather striking. A great deal of this has to do with huge shocks.
So the global financial crisis, then we had COVID, then we had war in Europe. And each time, governments have found, quite correctly, they need to be, as it were, the insurers of last resort.
Following COVID, we had this global spike in inflation, interest rates going through the roof. That means much more expensive debt servicing costs, debt interest costs for government.
Debt to GDP levels are roughly 100%, so the same amount of debt as these economies produce every year. The projections are they rise to the point where it gets a bit explosive.
My name is Olivier Blanchard. I've been a professor at MIT all my life, but I took a leave to go to the IMF. I joined in 2008. I had to deal with a global financial crisis and then the euro crisis. There's a number of countries which are addicted to debt, and I think the disease can hit any country at any time.
I'm Ray Dalio. I'm the founder of Bridgewater Associates, the largest hedge fund in the world. I'm a global macro investor. When debts accumulate and interest payments accumulate, the debt service payments squeeze other spending. And it's a particular problem when there's a need to borrow money in order to make debt service payments and the spiral begins.
Bonds are effectively an IOU. It's a way that the government can say to an investor, okay, you lend me this amount of money for this amount of time, and I will give it back to you after that amount of time. And in the interim, I will pay you interest payments called coupons. Now, because there are loads of different bonds, they've all got different maturities, they've all got different coupons attached to them, it can be a little bit difficult to compare apples with apples. So to do that, what we do is compare the yields that are available on bonds. Yields go up when prices go down. What governments generally don't want is for yields to go up too quickly or too fast, because that jacks up borrowing costs for everybody around the country. That's why you need a good bedrock of support, of buying support for bonds.
One man's debts are another man's assets. So in order to hold the debt, it has to be attractive. Then there is what some people call the debt death spiral, which means that there's selling of debt when there's worry about that.
People have been warning that this is getting out of control. That drumbeat is definitely getting louder now. We have seen the odd episode where it's looked like investors are saying, we're not buying any more of your bonds. That's when people start to get really jumpy.
I'm Karen Ward. I'm the Chief Market Strategist at JP Morgan Asset Management. So my job is to advise clients on what's going on around the world and help them make the best investment decisions. The level of government borrowing is certainly one of the top questions I get asked amongst clients today. Government debt is supposed to be our safe haven asset. It's supposed to be the bedrock of our portfolio. It's supposed to be the boring bit.
I'm Greg Peters, Co-Chief Investment Officer of PGIM Fixed Income. From a bond investing standpoint, what I worry about is inflation, right? And so inflation on the rise is just so difficult from an overall portfolio standpoint to protect yourself.
Bonds hate inflation. It's like kryptonite for them. They just can't live with it because it eats into their returns.
In a world where we're also being met with inflation shocks, then the role of government bonds as that safe haven diversifier that many investors look to isn't quite so clear.
There are times when an increase in debt is completely justified. Wars, or preparing for wars, or COVID. These are cases where you have to spend more. What we have seen in many countries is not that. It's basically just tomorrow is another day type behavior.
The world has been addicted to debt because debt has been for free. So we're coming out of this zero negative interest rate world where there's been nothing but encouraging taking on more debt.
I'm Stephanie Kelton, and I'm a professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook University. I do a lot of public speaking, finance, hedge fund, investment bank. That's my crowd. I can poll them before I go in and say, how many people think we should be reducing budget deficits? Almost every hand goes up. How many people are worried about the national debt? Almost every hand goes up. When I put this graph up, everything changes. This is the United States of America. The government has been running deficits for virtually my entire life. But look up, and they see surpluses in the rest of the world and surpluses in the U.S. private sector. If you want to eliminate the government deficit, you're going to erase all of the other surpluses because the one is creating the other. The government deficit is doing something very useful, which is creating a surplus, allowing the rest of us to net save. Their red ink is our black ink.
My name is Russell Napier, an advisor to investment institutions. One of my joys is also to be the keeper of the Library of Mistakes, a business and financial history library here in Edinburgh. There is an issue with there being too much borrowing in the government sector, but it has to be seen in conjunction with too much borrowing in the private sector. If we lived in a country where government debt to GDP was high, but the private sector debt to GDP was low, then the consequences of this government debt addiction would actually be quite different.
Private borrowing, and private debt and private markets are, in my view, just as big a problem. Really big private busts cause explosion of government debt. After the financial crisis, until the pandemic, and really a year or two after the pandemic, all we were worried about was inadequate demand and deflation. That was a world in which monetary policy was aggressively stimulative. Inflation has come back and the inflationary pressures seem quite strong.
When you're dealing with government's requirements in the political system, there's a desire for spending. When you get credit and you can hand things out on credit, at that time, it's better. Credit produces debt.
One of the ways we tried to deal with that situation for the last decade was to try and cut back on other areas of spending. But that's actually left us with a new problem. We haven't been committing enough to public services, public infrastructure. And you can see that the pressure is on governments around the West to, if you like, make up for the lost spending that happened during the decade of austerity.
You've got all these pressures which are building up. We've got quite weak growth, so you don't have hugely rapidly growing tax revenues.
You're gambling with World War III.
A more uncertain global security world, defense is going to become more of a priority, not less. An aging population. There's a green transition. Now, a lot of that needs some sort of public support to make it happen faster. And we're likely to see interest rates much higher than they were before, and that adds an additional burden.
We've now got to the point where it's pretty normal for governments to borrow on a kind of crisis pace every year.
In a world of low inflation, you can get away with this. Bond investors will fund you and fund you and fund you. But in a world where